There is a story, we are told, a nursery rhyme of history. It's a story of courage, of a lone man against a flat world, a story of discovery, of a triumph of the human spirit, the story of 1492, the story of Christopher Columbus. But what if that story is a lie? Not a simple misremembering, but a deliberate, foundational myth designed to hide a truth so monstrous it would redefine the very nature of our modern world. What if the man we were taught to celebrate as a great explorer was in fact something else entirely? What if he was the architect of a new kind of horror? The man who didn't discover a new world, but invented a new kind of hell for it. This is not the story of Christopher Columbus, the explorer. This is the story of Christopher Columbus, the father of modern slavery. To understand the man, we cannot begin in 1492. We must begin in the world that made him. Cristoforo Columbus was born in Genoa, a city of merchants, sailors, and moneylenders. He was not an aristocrat, but the son of a weaver, burning with an ambition that bordered on obsession. He was a man of immense self-belief, a religious fanatic who believed God had chosen him for a divine purpose. But his God was a partner in a business venture. The venture was a shortcut to the riches of the East. He pored over maps, but he wasn't a pioneering scientist. He was a ruthless editor of reality. He cherry-picked data, deliberately underestimating the circumference of the earth, ignoring the calculations of ancient Greeks and contemporary scholars. He wasn't proving the world was round. That was already widely known among the educated. He was selling a get-rich-quick scheme, promising a short, easy voyage to the gold and spices of Asia. For years, the courts of Europe laughed at him. They saw him for what he was, a crank, a dreamer, peddling bad math. But Columbus was relentless. His genius was not in navigation, but in persuasion, and he finally found a receptive audience in Spain. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand had just completed the Reconquista, a centuries-long war to expel the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. Their nation was forged in blood and religious zealotry. They were hungry for an edge over their rival Portugal. They were hungry for gold to fund their new empire. And Columbus, he promised them gold. The contract he signed with the Spanish crown was extraordinary. It named him Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor of all lands he might discover. It promised him 10% of all revenues, gold, silver, pearls, spices, and other things. The contract was a license not for exploration, but for exploitation. And on August 3rd, 1492, with a crew of nervous sailors and a head full of flawed geography and golden dreams, he set sail. The voyage was a testament to his willpower and his deceit. He kept a fake logbook showing a shorter distance traveled each day to quell the crew's rising panic. For 36 days they saw nothing but water. Mutiny simmered just below the surface. He was on the verge of failure, his dream turning to dust on a merciless sea. Then, on October 12, a lookout screamed the word they had all been praying for. Tierra! Tierra! Land. He had landed in what we now call the Bahamas. He had stumbled upon a world he could not have imagined. It was inhabited by the Taino people, In his own journal, Columbus describes them. They were, in his words, well built, of a good stature, handsome. They were peaceful and generous. He wrote, "They brought us parrots and bowls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for glass beads and hawks' bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They do not bear arms and do not know them. For I showed them a sword, they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance." A humane man, a true explorer, would have seen the dawn of a new understanding, a chance to learn, to connect, to marvel. Columbus saw something else. His mind was not filled with wonder, but with a chilling, immediate calculus. On the very first day of contact, this is what he wrote in his journal. "They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." The word was servants. The thought was subjugation. The number was 50 men. This was not an afterthought. It was the first thought. He saw their generosity as weakness, their innocence as an invitation, and he saw their small gold ornaments. That sealed their fate. For the next 3 months he sailed through the islands not as an ethnographer, but as a prospector. He kidnapped several Taino to act as guides and translators, the first of millions who would be stolen from their homes. He was searching for the source of the gold, and when he couldn't find the great mines he promised the crown, he knew he needed another commodity to prove his voyage was a success. He needed to bring back profit. When the Santa Maria ran aground on Hispaniola, he saw it not as a disaster, but as a sign from God. He left 39 of his men behind at a fort he named La Navidad. He gave them a simple mission: find the gold mine and collect as much of it as possible. Then he sailed back to Spain, a conquering hero. His return was a sensation. He had delivered on his promise, not of Asia, but of a world ripe to be taken. The crown, intoxicated by the possibilities, funded a second voyage. And this is where the story turns from encounter to invasion. This was no voyage of discovery. It was a mission of conquest. 17 ships, over 1,200 men, soldiers, cavalry with war horses, attack dogs trained to tear human flesh, priests and colonists. Columbus returned not as an admiral, but as a warlord. When he arrived back at La Navidad, he found the fort burned to the ground and his 39 men dead. They had been killed by the Taino after the Spaniards had roamed the island, raping women and enslaving locals in their lust for gold. For the Taino, the lesson was learned. These were not gods, they were monsters. For Columbus, it was the pretext he needed for war. This is where Columbus makes his most terrible innovation. He needed to reward his colonists and pacify the island. He created a system, a blueprint for colonial subjugation. It was called the encomienda system. The crown would grant a Spanish colonist a tract of land, but the land was worthless without labor, so the granting pruded the people on it. Hundreds of indigenous souls were entrusted to a colonist who was supposed to protect them and convert them to Christianity. In reality, it was slavery by another name, a mask of piety on a face of pure greed. The Taino were now property. Then came the tribute system. Every Taino over the age of 14 was forced to deliver a hawk's bell full of gold dust every 3 months. A hawk's bell. It's a tiny thing. But the gold simply wasn't there in such quantities. It was an impossible demand. And what was the punishment for failure? It was a punishment of horrific symbolic cruelty. Those who failed to meet their quota had their hands cut off and were left to bleed to death with their severed hands tied around their necks as a warning to others. Thousands were hunted, killed, or committed suicide. They poisoned themselves with cassava juice. Mothers killed their own babies to save them from the Spaniards. An entire culture began to self-destruct under the weight of this impossible cruelty.
When the gold tribute failed, Columbus turned to the commodity he had identified on day one: human bodies. In 1495, he rounded up 1,600 Taino men, women, and children. He selected the 500 best specimens and shipped them to the slave markets of Seville, Spain. He initiated the transatlantic slave trade. 200 died on the voyage, their bodies thrown into the Atlantic. The rest were sold. The Queen was momentarily displeased, but the precedent had been set. A new world of disposable people had been opened for business. Columbus's reign as governor was so brutal, so catastrophic, that even the Spanish colonists, themselves no angels, complained. They wrote back to the crown not about the cruelty to the Taino, but about his mismanagement, his tyrannical behavior toward Spaniards, and his failure to deliver the promised riches. The colony was in chaos. In 1500, the crown sent a royal commissioner to investigate. He was so horrified by what he found, he had Columbus arrested. The admiral of the ocean sea, the great discoverer, was put in chains and sent back to Spain in disgrace. It is a powerful image, the hero brought low, but we must be clear. He was not arrested for genocide. He was not arrested for instituting mass slavery or for cutting off people's hands. He was arrested for being a bad administrator, for failing to govern the Spanish colonists effectively. The suffering of the native people was merely a footnote in the charges against him. He would be pardoned and allowed 2 more voyages, but his power was broken. He died in 1506, a wealthy but bitter man, still clinging to the delusion that he had reached the outskirts of Asia. He died never comprehending the true scale of what he had unleashed. And what was his legacy? Before 1492, the island of Hispaniola had a population estimated between 300,000 and 1 million people. By 1514, just 22 years later, there were only 22,000 Taino left. By 1542, fewer than 200 were recorded. Today, they are gone. It was a genocide, one of the most complete and rapid in human history. And the systems he created, the encomienda, the justification of enslaving non-Christians, the use of terror as a tool of policy, this became the blueprint, the model that was replicated and refined by Cortés in Mexico, by Pizarro in Peru, by colonizers across 2 continents for the next 400 years. When the indigenous populations were worked to death, the colonists simply looked for a new source of labor, turning to Africa and creating the largest forced migration in history. So, when we look at a statue of Columbus, what are we really looking at? Are we celebrating a brave navigator who crossed an ocean? Or are we venerating the man who stood on a pristine beach, looked at a peaceful, generous people, and in his mind immediately put them in chains? The man whose obsession with gold lit the fire of a centuries-long Holocaust. The man who laid the first bloody bricks in the foundation of modern race-based chattel slavery.
The story of history is never simple, but the myth of Columbus is a dangerous one. It asks us to celebrate the beginning of an era of unprecedented exploitation as a moment of glorious discovery. It asks us to admire the pioneer and ignore the price of his progress. A price paid in millions of lives, in shattered cultures, and in a wound on the soul of the world that has not yet healed. The nursery rhyme is over. It's time to face the truth.